Chapter 1. The Country Beyond the Mountains. East of the lands Ulf had walked for 9 years, past the last of the familiar fjords and the last of the pine forests he had come to know as well as the lines of his own hands. There was a range of mountains that most people in those parts called simply the Wall. Not because they were impassable, though they were difficult enough to cross, but because they marked the edge of the world that most people had any interest in knowing. On the near side of the mountains there were farms and villages and roads that connected them, markets and temples, and the ordinary machinery of a life lived among other people. On the far side there was something else, something older, a country that had not been arranged for human convenience, that had grown up according to its own logic over so many centuries that it had taken on a quality difficult to name but easy to feel, the quality of a place that has been thinking its own thoughts for a very long time and is not particularly interested in yours. Ulf crossed the mountains in the early days of summer, following a pass that a trader in the last village before the foothills had described to him in exchange for a story about the Volva he had met by the river. The trader had crossed the pass twice in his youth and remembered it clearly, the way you remember things that frightened you when you were young, with a mixture of pride and lingering unease. He said the pass was not dangerous exactly. There were no sudden drops, no unstable ground, no places where the path disappeared entirely. What it was, he said, was strange. The light was different up there. Not darker, not brighter, just different, as if it were coming from a slightly different direction than you expected, always arriving from just past the edge of your vision. And the silence was of a kind he had not encountered anywhere else. Not the silence of a quiet morning or a snowfall, but a silence that felt deliberate, as if something very large were being very careful not to make a sound. Ulf thanked him and climbed into the mountains the following morning. The pass took 2 days, and the trader was right about the light and right about the silence, and Ulf noted both in his book and tried to describe them accurately, which was difficult, and settled for noting the difficulty as part of the description, which felt more honest. He came down out of the mountains on the evening of the 2nd day into a landscape that was immediately and unmistakably different from what he had left behind. The light was lower and more golden. The trees were of kinds he did not have names for. The grass in the valley below was a deeper green than the grass of the north, a green that seemed to go further down into the earth before it stopped being green, as if the color itself had roots. He made camp at the tree line and sat for a long time watching the valley below him in the evening light. There were no houses visible, no smoke, no paths or clearings that suggested human habitation. But there was a river, and rivers always led somewhere eventually, and Ulf had learned that following water was usually more productive than having a destination. He ate the last of the dried fish from his pack and drank from a stream that ran clear and cold over pale stones, and watched the first stars appear above the eastern hills, and felt, as he had not felt in some time, the particular excitement of being somewhere entirely new, a country whose stories he did not yet know, a landscape that had not yet spoken to him because he had not yet learned its language, and the knowledge that learning it was what the next weeks and months would bring. He slept on the ground with his pack as a pillow, and woke before dawn to birdsong of kinds he had not heard before, rich and varied and seeming to come from everywhere at once, and lay still and listened to it for a long time before rising and beginning the descent into the valley, into the eastern country, into the stories that were waiting there, patient as the mountains, old as the grass. In the first week, he walked without meeting anyone. The valley he had descended into opened gradually into a wider plain, and the plain was crossed by rivers and covered in the kind of grassland that suggested animals rather than farming. The grass long and various, full of flowers he had no names for, moving in the wind in long, slow waves that made the whole plain seem alive in a way that was not threatening but was certainly attentive. He saw deer at a distance, and something larger that moved through the tall grass without revealing itself, and birds of extraordinary size riding the thermals above the hills to the south, and everywhere the feeling that he was being observed, not with hostility, simply with the mild curiosity of a country looking at something new. On the 8th day he saw smoke, and walked toward it, and found a farmstead very different from the ones he had known in the north. Lower, built partly into the earth, with walls of stone rather than timber, and a roof that was entirely grass, continuous with the hillside it was built against, so that the house from a distance was almost invisible, a fold in the landscape rather than a structure placed upon it. The people who came out to meet him were dark-haired and shorter than the northern people he had known, with the careful, deliberate manner of people who have learned that strangers come rarely and are therefore worth examining properly before deciding what to make of them. Their language was unlike anything he had encountered, a flowing tongue with many sounds he had no equivalents for in his own mouth. But they had a little of the northern trading tongue, enough to establish that he was a traveler, not a threat, hungry, and interested in stories. The last quality seemed to interest them particularly. The oldest person in the household, a woman of perhaps 70 with the kind of face that has been shaped by decades of outdoor weather into something that seems hewn rather than grown, looked at him for a long time after he mentioned stories and then said something to the others that he could not follow, and they all looked at him again, and then she nodded and gestured for him to come inside. He stayed a week. In that week, he learned the words for fire and water and thank you, and I do not understand, and please say that again. He learned that the country east of the mountains was called, in their language, something that translated approximately as the country the sky remembers, a name that seemed to him, as he thought about it over the following months, more accurate than most names he had encountered. He learned that there were other settlements further east and south, and that there was, if he followed the river for long enough, a place that all the settlements in that country referred to with a particular kind of careful reverence, the way people refer to a thing they believe in, but are not entirely certain they have the right to speak about too directly. He asked what the place was called. The old woman thought about how to translate it for a long time, and then said, slowly and with evident dissatisfaction at the inadequacy of the translation, "The place where the tree's root drinks." Chapter 2. The Village of the Weavers. 3 weeks east of the first farmstead, following the river as the old woman had suggested, Ulf came to a village that was larger than he had expected, perhaps 60 or 70 houses arranged in a rough circle around a central open space, in the middle of which stood a structure he could not immediately identify. Not a building exactly. A framework of poles and crosspieces very tall, from which hundreds of threads descended in a complex pattern, some dyed, some undyed, catching the light differently, depending on their angle, so that the whole structure seemed to shift and breathe as he walked toward it. The people of this village were weavers. Not exclusively, they farmed and kept animals and did all the other things that people do to sustain a life, but weaving was clearly the thing they did above all others, the thing that organized their time and their attention and their relationship with each other. Every house had a loom, or more than one. The sound of the village was the sound of looms, the rhythmic clack and thud that had been the background sound of every settled human place Ulf had passed through, but here amplified and multiplied until it was almost like weather, a low constant percussion beneath everything else. He was received with the particular courtesy of people who are secure enough in their own identity to be genuinely curious about others rather than threatened by them, and given a place to sleep in the house of a family whose head was a man of middle age named something that Ulf rendered in his book as Daran, which was as close as his mouth could come to the actual sound. Daran was a weaver of exceptional skill, and he knew it without being particularly pleased about it. The way a person knows any fact about themselves that has simply always been true. He could weave patterns that other weavers in the village took weeks to produce in a fraction of the time. But more importantly, he could weave patterns that no one else could produce at all. Patterns that he said came to him in the time between sleeping and waking, neither dream nor thought, but something that arrived from somewhere else and demanded to be made real before it disappeared. Ulf spent 2 weeks with Daran and his family, and in that time, through the gradual accumulation of shared meals and evenings by the fire and the patient labor of two people trying to communicate across a significant language barrier, he came to understand something about the weaving that he had not expected. The weavers of this village did not weave cloth in the ordinary sense, or rather they did weave cloth, practical cloth that served all the purposes cloth has always served, but they also wove something else. Stories. Every pattern in the cloth was a story, or a piece of one, and the people of the village could read them the way Ulf could read the marks in his book, though with a fluency and depth he could only approximate, since the patterns operated on multiple levels simultaneously, conveying not just events but the quality of events, not just what had happened but what it had felt like to be present when it happened. The texture and temperature and emotional weight of the moment preserved in the structure of the cloth as accurately as Ulf tried to preserve such things in words. He asked Darin, on the evening of the 10th day, whether the patterns were invented or remembered. Darin thought about this for a long time, holding a piece of finished cloth in his hands and running his fingers over the surface the way a blind person reads a text. Then he said, slowly, choosing his words from the limited shared vocabulary they had built together, the patterns are found. Not invented, not remembered, found. They exist somewhere that is not here, and the weaving is the act of bringing them into here. He paused, he said, the tree has roots that go very deep, the patterns come from the roots. I do not understand them all, I weave them because they ask to be woven. Ulf wrote this down very carefully, and then sat with it for a long time, looking at the cloth in the firelight, trying to see what Darin could see in it, and failing, and being glad of the failure, because it meant there was still something here that exceeded his capacity to grasp it, and things that exceeded his capacity to grasp them were, in his experience, the things most worth paying attention to. On the last day, Darin gave him a piece of cloth, small enough to fold and carry in his pack, woven in a pattern he said he had made specifically for Ulf. He could not tell Ulf what the pattern meant, not because he was unwilling, but because the language they shared was not adequate to carry the meaning. He said only that it was true, which Ulf took to mean that it was accurate, that whatever it depicted or conveyed was an honest representation of something real. Ulf put it in his pack beside the carved bone from the Volva's hair, and the knife from the smith named Sindri, and the book that was now almost full, and walked on east along the river. Chapter 3: The Old Road. 2 days east of the weaver's village, the river curved south, and Ulf, not wanting to go south, left it and walked east across open country that was neither grassland nor forest, but something between the two, scattered trees growing without apparent pattern across a ground cover of low scrub and wildflowers. The whole landscape arranged with the loose informality of something that has been growing without interference for a very long time. He walked for 3 days without seeing any sign of human habitation, which was unusual enough to be interesting rather than alarming. He was not short of food, the land was full of edible things, and the weather was warm and clear, and the walking was easy, the ground firm and the gradient gentle, and he was content. On the 4th day he found the road. He almost missed it. It was not obvious, partly because it was very old and had been encroached upon from both sides by the vegetation of centuries, and partly because it did not look like what his experience had taught him roads looked like. It was paved, which was the first surprise, with flat stones set so closely together that even after what must have been hundreds of years of neglect, very little had pushed up between them. The stones were a dark grey that was almost black, and they were smooth, worn smooth by feet that had not passed over them in a very long time, polished to a faint sheen that caught the light in a way ordinary stone did not. The road was perhaps 5 paces wide and ran exactly east-west, straight as a line drawn on a map, without the slight curves and adjustments that most roads made to accommodate the landscape. This road went through the landscape as if the landscape were an afterthought. He stood on it for a long time before he walked on it. He had the feeling, which he had learned to take seriously over 9 years of walking, that some places required a moment of acknowledgement before you entered them, that there was a courtesy owed to very old things, a pause before proceeding that was not superstition exactly, but was the practical wisdom of someone who had noticed that things went better when you paid attention to thresholds. Then he walked east on the road, and the stone was solid and certain under his feet, and the vegetation on either side gradually thinned as if the road were reasserting itself, reclaiming its margins as he walked. And by midday he could see the road stretching ahead of him for a considerable distance, straight and dark and very deliberate, cutting through the landscape, with the authority of something built by people who had no doubt about where they were going or why. He followed it for 5 days. He saw no one on it, which did not surprise him, but he found evidence of others who had been there before him. Small cairns of stones built at intervals along the road's edge, some recent enough that the stones had not yet settled into their final positions, some so old that moss had covered them entirely and they were barely distinguishable from natural outcroppings. He added a stone to each cairn as he passed, which was a custom he had encountered in several places in his travels, a way of participating in a tradition without needing to know its origin or purpose, the act of adding being its own sufficient reason. On the third day, he found writing on one of the road's paving stones. Not a rune system he recognized, not anything he had seen in any of the alphabets he had encountered in his years of walking, but clearly writing, clearly intentional marks made by someone who had wanted to say something to whoever came after. He copied it into his book carefully, every stroke exactly as it appeared in the stone, and sat beside it for a while thinking about the person who had carved it, in what year, for what reason, with what hope that it would be read. He thought about the distance between the intent to communicate and the actual communication, the enormous gulf of time and language and changed circumstance that a message had to cross to reach anyone, and the fact that some messages crossed it anyway, that something in the marks was legible even if the specific meaning was not, that the fact of having been said was itself a kind of meaning that survived when the particular content did not. On the 5th day the road ended. Not gradually, not with any deterioration of quality or narrowing of width, but simply and completely, the paving stones ending in a straight line as if someone had drawn a boundary and said, "The road goes this far and no further." On the other side of the line, the ground was ordinary earth and grass, and there was nothing to indicate that the road had ever continued beyond this point. No worn track in the earth, no remnant of stones buried beneath the turf. The road ended here, and that was all. Ulf stood at the end of the road for a long time. He looked back along it to the western horizon, where it disappeared in a slight curve of the landscape, still straight, still purposeful, still going somewhere specific. He looked at the ordinary earth beyond the line where it ended. He thought about the people who had built it, the enormous effort of quarrying and transporting and laying those stones across this landscape, and about the fact that whatever purpose had required that effort had evidently been fulfilled at exactly this point, that the destination had been here, at this unremarkable piece of ground, and that whatever had been here when the road was in use was now entirely gone, leaving nothing behind it but the road itself, ending in a straight line in the grass. He walked on east, off the road now, carrying it in his mind. Chapter 4. The Woman Who Kept the Bees. A week east of where the old road ended, in a shallow valley where a stand of linden trees grew along a small stream, Ulf found a house that was unusual in every way he could identify. It was round, for one thing, built of a mix of stone and clay with a domed roof covered in living sod, from which flowers grew in season. It was surrounded, for another, by an extraordinary number of beehives, perhaps 40 or 50 of them, arranged in rows on the south-facing slope above the house, each one different from the others in its construction. Some of woven straw, some of hollowed logs, some of clay formed into shapes that suggested not just containers but dwellings, small houses with their own particular character and proportion. The sound of the place was extraordinary. He heard it before he saw it, a low, continuous hum that at first he took for wind in the linden trees, but which grew as he approached into something richer and more complex, layered, multiple frequencies woven together into a sound that was not quite music, but had the quality of music, the quality of something organized, of many individual elements contributing to a whole that had its own distinct character. By the time he reached the gate of the low fence that surrounded the hives and the house, the sound was all around him, and he stood still inside it and felt it in his chest. Not unpleasant, not alarming, simply present, the way the sound of a river is present when you stand beside it. The woman who came out of the house was perhaps 60, though she had the kind of face and movement that made age difficult to estimate, the kind that comes from spending a great deal of time outdoors in a particular relationship with the physical world, engaged and attentive rather than merely exposed to it. She was wearing a hat of woven straw, and her hands and arms were bare, and she showed no particular surprise at his arrival, which suggested either that she had been expecting him or that she was accustomed to the arrival of strangers in a way that had long since removed the element of surprise. Her name was Murrit, and she had been keeping bees in this valley for 30 years. She had come here as a young woman from a settlement 3 days to the north, following the bees, which she said was not a metaphor. She had kept bees since childhood, had always had a particular relationship with them that she described, matter-of-factly and without any apparent expectation that he would find it unusual, as a conversation. Not a conversation with words, but with attention. The bees paid attention to her, and she paid attention to the bees, and in this exchange of attention, maintained over decades, something had been built that she called, using the trading tongue word she thought was closest, understanding. She showed him the hives over the course of the first afternoon. Each one, she explained, had its own character, its own particular quality, as distinct as the characters of people. The hive in the hollowed linden log on the far left of the top row was, she said, patient and methodical, its bees careful workers who rarely swarmed and produced honey of unusual consistency. The clay hive in the middle of the second row was unpredictable, capable of extraordinary productivity in some years and near dormancy in others. Its moods seemingly unrelated to the weather or the available forage, driven by something internal that she had been trying to understand for 20 years without success. She had come to believe, she said, that some natures were simply not reducible to explanation, that the attempt to explain them fully was a form of disrespect, and that the right relationship with such natures was not understanding, but accommodation. They ate that evening beside the house with the sound of the bees around them, which did not diminish at dusk but changed quality, lowering slightly, becoming more even, the hum of the hives settling into their nighttime register. She told him about the honey and about what the honey knew, which was a concept he had to ask her to explain several times before he had something approaching a grasp of it. She said that bees, in the course of their daily work, gathered not just nectar but information, the condition of the landscape for miles in every direction, the health of every flowering plant they visited, the quality of the light and the temperature and the moisture in the air. All of this information was encoded in the honey, not in any way that she had been able to fully decode, but in ways she had learned over 30 years to partially read. The honey from a summer of drought tasted different from the honey of a wet summer, and not just in the way you would expect from the changed quality of the flowers. It tasted of the drought itself, of the particular quality of that scarcity, something in it that spoke of endurance and adaptation, and the specific kind of beauty that belonged to dry, bright days, and the desperate resourcefulness of flowers in hard conditions. She gave him a small clay vessel sealed with wax and told him it contained honey from the most recent summer, which had been a summer of unusual weather, neither wet nor dry but changeable in ways that the bees had found interesting. She said the honey would keep for years if the seal held, and that if he ever opened it in a place very different from this valley, on a morning when he had had time and quiet, he might find that it tasted of here, of this particular slope in this particular light, and that this would be a true thing, a genuine piece of the world carried from one place to another, which was in her view the most that you could ask of any object. He put the vessel in his pack with great care, and slept that night to the sound of the hives, which was, he wrote in his book before the light failed completely, the most entirely peaceful sound he had encountered in 9 and more years of walking, like the world breathing at the right speed, like something very large and very old simply continuing. Chapter 5: The Ruins on the Hill. East of the Beekeeper's Valley, the land changed again, rising into a series of long ridges running north to south that he had to cross, rather than follow, which meant a succession of climbs and descents that were not difficult but were tiring in the accumulated way of many moderate efforts. The ridges were covered in heather and rough grass and occasional outcroppings of grey rock, and from the top of each one he could see the next ridge ahead, and beyond it the suggestion of more ridges, the landscape repeating itself in diminishing clarity until it dissolved into a haze that might have been distance or might have been the beginning of weather. On the third ridge he saw the ruins. They occupied the summit of a hill perhaps a mile to the north, which meant going off his eastward route, and he hesitated for a moment and then went north because ruins of that scale, visible from this distance, were not something he could reasonably walk past. They were large, the walls still standing in places to a considerable height, the stone the same dark grey as the old road he had walked, which might or might not mean anything. As he climbed toward them, the scale continued to resolve upward until he was standing at the edge of what had been a very significant structure, large enough to have housed hundreds of people, its walls enclosing an area that, in its day, would have seemed to him like a small town. He spent 2 days in the ruins. The first day he simply walked through them, mapping the spaces in his mind, trying to understand the layout and purpose of what had been built here. There was a central hall, unmistakably, its walls higher than the others, a great fireplace at one end still largely intact. Around it were smaller rooms of various sizes, some clearly domestic, some whose purpose he could not determine. There were the remains of what might have been workshops, of what was almost certainly a stable, of something that had the quality of a sacred space without any of the usual markers of a sacred space. No altar, no carved images, just a room of unusual proportions and a quality of light that came through openings in the walls at angles that seemed deliberate, that seemed to be about the light specifically rather than about ventilation or visibility. On the second day he wrote. He sat in the central hall with his back against the great fireplace and wrote about the ruins and about what it felt like to be in a place that had clearly once been full of life, full of the noise and heat and complexity of people living closely together, and was now entirely empty and entirely silent except for the wind that moved through the openings where doors and windows had been. He wrote about the particular kind of grief that old ruins produce, which is different from other kinds of grief, more abstract and more spacious, a grief not for specific lost people, but for the general fact of loss, for the knowledge that everything that matters to people eventually stops mattering to anyone, that the fires that were most carefully tended eventually go out, and then he wrote about the other thing ruins produce, which was harder to name but equally real, something that was almost the opposite of grief, a quality of perseverance that the stones themselves seemed to embody, their continued standing in the face of everything that had tried to bring them down, the storms and the frosts and the simple patient erosion of years. Something in the ruins said, "We are still here," which was true and which seemed important. He found, on the second afternoon, a carving in the stone of the central hall. Not the writing from the road, not anything he had encountered before, but a tree. An ash tree, unmistakably, though rendered in a style he did not recognize, with deep spreading roots at the bottom of the image and high branching canopy at the top, and in the branches and roots small figures that might have been animals, or might have been something else entirely, too worn by time to be certain. Below the tree a single figure, larger than the others, standing at the base of the trunk with one hand raised, not in greeting or supplication but in something more like acknowledgement, the gesture of someone saying, "I see you," or perhaps, "I know you are there." He sat with this carving for a long time, and then copied it into his book with as much accuracy as his hand could manage, and sat with the copy for a while, and then closed the book and put it away, and sat in the empty hall with the wind coming through the openings and the light moving across the stone floor as the afternoon wore on. He left the next morning and walked east and did not look back, which was his custom, but carried the image of the tree with the figure at its base through all the days that followed. Chapter 6. The River of Two Voices. In the flatlands east of the ridges, There was a river that Ulf heard before he reached it, in a way that made him stop walking and listen for a long time, trying to understand what he was hearing. It was not the sound of a single river. It was two sounds, distinct but overlapping, as if two rivers were running in the same channel, each with its own character and speed and vocal quality, their voices interwoven but not merged, each remaining itself while participating in something larger. When he reached the bank, he understood. Two rivers had joined here, recently enough, by the look of the confluence that the waters had not yet fully mixed, and the two streams ran side by side in the combined channel, the one from the north darker and faster, the one from the east paler and slower, their boundary a visible line down the center of the river, distinct for perhaps a mile downstream, before the mixing finally overcame the difference, and the river became one thing again. He stood on the bank and watched the two-voiced river for a long time. The way the faster, darker water pushed against the slower, paler water, and the slower, paler water resisted with a quiet persistence that was more effective than it looked, and thought about the things that could run side by side for a time without merging, and about what happened eventually when they did merge, and whether the merged thing was better than either of the unmixed ones, or simply different, and whether different was the same as better, or whether that was the wrong question entirely. He found a crossing half a mile downstream, where the river had widened and shallowed over a gravel bed, and crossed with his boots around his neck and the cold water above his knees, and on the far bank he sat and dried his feet and ate and wrote. He wrote about the two-voiced river for a long time and felt, as he sometimes did when writing, that he was getting closer to something but not quite reaching it, that the thing he was trying to say was just past the edge of what his words could do, and that this was the condition of writing about certain things, that they exceeded the capacity of words not because they were ineffable, but because they were genuinely more complex than language. And that the writing was valuable not despite this failure, but because of it, because it showed the shape of the thing that exceeded it the way a container shows the shape of what it held even after that thing is gone. There was a settlement on the east bank of the river, 3 houses close together near the water, clearly aware of and accommodated to the two-voiced river in their daily life, their fishing nets strung across the boundary between the two streams where, one of the people there told him, the fish were most reliably found, drawn to the edge between the two waters by whatever instinct drew fish to boundaries. The people there were a family, 3 generations living in the 3 houses, connected to each other by the river in the particular way of people whose livelihood depends on a specific place, whose knowledge of that place has accumulated over decades into something that was genuinely expertise, that could not be learned from a book or a teacher, but only from years of daily attention. The oldest member of the family, a man who had fished this river for 60 years and whose hands showed it, took Ulf out on the water in the early morning of the second day, before full light, in a flat boat he handled with the effortless skill of total familiarity. They went to the boundary between the two streams and sat there in the boat, while the old man set lines and Ulf watched the water. In the grey pre-dawn, the two streams were visible not by their colour difference but by their different textures, the faster stream rougher and more restless even at this hour, the slower stream smoother, almost oily in its surface calm. The boundary between them was a line of tiny disturbances, a narrow zone of turbulence where the two natures met and negotiated and neither gave way entirely. The old man said in the trading tongue and slowly, because he had few words but wanted to be understood, that his grandfather had told him that the rivers had a story, that the faster, darker river from the north was old, older than any river in the surrounding country, and that the paler, slower river from the east had come later, had arrived at this confluence in his grandfather's grandfather's time, which would have made it perhaps 200 years ago. And that when the eastern river arrived, the northern river had not absorbed it immediately, that for several generations the two had run side by side the full length of the combined channel, remaining distinct for miles, before finally beginning to mix. And that the old people of that time had said the rivers were learning each other, which the old man seemed to find an entirely accurate description that required no further elaboration. Ulf wrote this down and then sat with the lines in the grey morning light and waited for fish and thought about rivers learning each other and found this like the best of the things he encountered and wrote down, resistant to being thought all the way through, always opening onto something further when he pressed it. Chapter 7. The Keeper of the High Pasture. North of the river flatlands, the land rose again, gradually and then steeply, into a highland that the river family called, in their language, the Roof, which seemed apt. It was high ground of the kind that has its own weather, its own seasons slightly out of phase with the valleys below, its own particular light that was clearer and harder than lowland light, as if the additional altitude had filtered out some quality that made lower light softer and left only the essential brightness. The grass up there was short and tough and a color that was not quite the green of lower pastures, but a grey-green that was more honest somehow, more itself, less interested in being appealing. There were sheep on the high pasture, hundreds of them, spread across the hillside in the loose arrangement of animals that are contained by landscape rather than by fences, knowing where the ground became too steep or too rocky to be worth going and staying within those limits without being told. They were the large, grey-fleeced sheep of high country, built for cold and wind, their wool so dense it seemed less like a covering than a structural feature, something they could not be imagined without. The person who kept them was named Sigrid, which was a name from the north, and when Ulf asked her about it she said her grandmother had come from the north, from the other side of the mountains, which explained the name and also, in his view, explained certain things about her manner that had seemed to him simultaneously familiar and out of place in this eastern country. She was perhaps 45, with the particular quality of someone who had spent most of her adult life alone or nearly alone, whose relationship with solitude had long since passed through every stage from discomfort to tolerance to active preference. She was direct in conversation, in a way that was not unfriendly, but had lost interest in the usual softening conventions, the preliminary courtesies and the careful indirections that most people use to manage the awkwardness of new encounters. She had been keeping this pasture for 20 years, coming up in late spring and descending in early winter, spending the long summer months alone with the sheep and whatever travelers happened to pass through, which was not many, perhaps 3 or 4 a year. She had a small stone shelter built into the hillside that was barely large enough for a bed and a fire and a table, and she lived in it with an ease and satisfaction that was immediately apparent and that Ulf found himself envying without quite being able to say why. She had simplified her life to its essential components, and the simplification had not diminished it, had if anything increased it, the way cutting away what is not necessary reveals what is. He stayed 4 days. In the mornings he walked with her while she checked the sheep, which involved a great deal of covering ground and a quality of attention to each animal that was impressive in its detail. She could identify each sheep by sight and knew the current condition of each one and what had changed in each one since the previous morning's check. She explained this not as a special ability, but as the inevitable result of having looked at the same animals every day for 20 years, which was simply what happened when you paid attention to something long enough. In the evenings they sat outside the shelter when the weather was good and inside when it was not, and she talked, and he listened and wrote. She talked about the high pasture and its qualities through the seasons, the particular beauty of early spring when the first flowers appeared in the still brown grass, so early and so small that you had to be looking for them to see them. She talked about the storms that came across the high ground from the west, faster than storms in the valleys, arriving with less warning and departing more quickly, violent and then gone, leaving a clarity behind them that felt earned rather than given. She talked about the nights, which were on clear nights extraordinary, the sky at this altitude containing more stars than she had believed possible before she had spent her first summer here. The Milky Way not a suggestion but a presence, a river of light above the dark hills. And she talked, on the last evening, about what she had learned from the sheep. She said this without self-consciousness and with the matter-of-factness she brought to everything, and what she had learned from the sheep, stated simply, was that attention was enough. That a life organized entirely around paying attention to something, to anything, was a full life. That the sheep did not ask to be philosophically interesting, had no interest in being instructive, were simply sheep doing the things sheep did, and that 20 years of watching them do those things had been the most interesting 20 years she could imagine, had revealed more about the nature of things than any amount of travel or study or conversation. She said, "You are a walker, you have been to many places and heard many stories, and I do not doubt that this is also a good way. But I want you to know that staying is also a way, that going nowhere and watching carefully is also a way, that the world is just as large from one hillside as from 1,000 roads, if you look at it properly." He wrote this down and thought about it for a long time, lying in his bedroll in the shelter, while the wind moved over the high ground outside and the sheep made their soft sounds in the dark. Chapter 8. The Forest of Small Lights. South of the high pasture, following a valley that curved gradually eastward, Ulf entered a forest that was different from any forest he had been in. The difference was not immediately apparent. The trees were large and old, and the canopy was dense, and the light on the forest floor was the filtered, underwater light of any old forest. But there was something else, a quality he noticed first as a peripheral phenomenon, something at the edge of vision that was gone when he turned to look at it directly, and then, as his eyes adjusted to the forest light and his attention settled, as something more substantial. The forest floor was covered in a luminescence. Not bright, not dramatic, nothing that would have been noticeable in daylight or that would have constituted what you could call a glow in any conventional sense. But in the dimness of the deep forest, which dimmed further as he went deeper and the canopy closed overhead, there was a faint cold light coming from the ground, from the moss and the fallen wood, and the root systems of the trees, a blue-green light that was exactly the color of shallow northern sea water in summer, pale and clear and very faint. He stood still for a long time and looked at it, and then crouched down and looked more closely and identified it as something he had heard of but never seen, the bioluminescence of certain fungi, the light generated by living organisms as a byproduct of their chemistry, a light that served no apparent purpose for the thing producing it except perhaps this, that it was beautiful, that it made the dark forest floor into something that seemed, in the dim human perception of it, like the floor of a shallow sea, or like a sky with very small stars in it, or like the inside of something large and dark that had its own sources of illumination. He made camp at the edge of the luminescent area and waited for full dark, and when full dark came the light was more apparent, not bright but present, unmistakable, the forest floor glowing with its cold blue-green light in the blackness of a clouded night, and he sat and looked at it for a long time without writing, which was unusual for him. There was nothing to write, or rather there was too much to write. The experience was too complete in itself to survive the reduction that writing imposed was one of those things. He was beginning to understand there were such things that could only be held as experience and not as record. He held it. He spent 3 days in the forest, which was 3 days more than he had planned, because the forest kept offering him things he had not expected. On the second day, he found a clearing in which the luminescence was particularly dense, a circle of perhaps 20 paces across, in which the light was bright enough to read by, which seemed impossible, but which he tested and confirmed by sitting in the center with his book and reading several pages by the cold blue-green light of the forest floor. He read an entry from early in the book from his first year of walking, a description of a valley he had passed through in autumn, when he had been walking for perhaps 6 weeks and had not yet settled into walking as the primary condition of his life. He read it with the interest of someone reading about a person they had known well long ago and found still recognizable but altered, the same fundamental nature differently arranged, the same attention to the world but focused through a different and less practiced lens. On the third day he found the tree. It was at the center of the area of densest luminescence, which he had been walking toward for 2 days without knowing it, and it was dead, had been dead for a long time, its bark long gone and its wood bleached white by decades of weather, but it was still standing, which was unusual for a tree that far gone in decay. And it was itself luminescent, not just the fungi on its surface but the wood itself, the dead white wood lit from within by a light that was the same cold blue-green as the forest floor, but stronger, denser, a light that suggested not just chemical process but something more intentional, as if the tree was still doing something, still participating in the life of the forest, still present in some mode that his understanding of life and death was not quite adequate to describe. He sat with the dead luminescent tree for the rest of that day and wrote, eventually, though not immediately. He wrote about life that continued past the boundaries of what he had previously thought of as life, about the way the tree was feeding the forest with its decay, was in a genuine sense still part of the living system of the forest, more intimately connected to it in death than it had been in life when it had stood separate from the ground. About the light which he could not explain and did not try to, but which seemed to him to be saying something, though what exactly it was saying he could not determine, only that it was saying it steadily and without urgency, the way things that have been true for a very long time are said. Chapter 9. The Valley of the Long Sleep. East of the forest, the land opened again into a wide valley, shaped like a hand cupped to receive something. The hills on all sides curving inward toward a center that held a lake of unusual stillness. Not the iron-gray stillness of the northern lake that remembered, but a different stillness, a blue-green stillness that reflected the sky so perfectly that at certain times of day, when the light was right, the lake seemed to disappear, to become simply a piece of sky that had fallen to earth and stayed there, unaware that it was no longer in the right place. The settlement beside the lake was small, perhaps 20 houses, and the people there had the quality of people who live in a place that is beautiful enough to require some accommodation of the beauty, who have grown up alongside something extraordinary and have had to develop a particular relationship with it, neither awestruck nor indifferent but something more nuanced, a daily acknowledgement that does not diminish through repetition because the thing being acknowledged renews itself constantly. The story he heard there on the first evening, sitting outside a house that faced the lake with the last of the day's light turning the water a deep gold, was about sleep. Not about death, as stories about long sleep often were, but about sleep itself, about what happened in sleep, about where people went when they slept and what they brought back. The woman who told it was perhaps 50, with the careful, precise manner of someone who takes the responsibility of storytelling seriously and has thought about how to do it well. She said that in this valley there was a tradition, very old, going back further than anyone could trace, of taking seriously the things that came in sleep. Not dreams exactly, or not only dreams, but the whole experience of sleep, which she distinguished from dreaming in a way that took him some time to follow, but which he eventually understood as the difference between the specific images and narratives of dreams and the more general state of being that sleep produced, the quality of consciousness that sleep created, what the sleeper brought back in terms of altered understanding or perception or relationship with the world. In this valley, she said, People kept what she called sleep journals, not records of dreams, but records of the state of mind they woke with, the quality of understanding they carried back from sleep into waking, the things that seemed different after sleep than they had seemed before. She had been keeping such a journal for 30 years, and she said that over that time certain patterns had emerged, that there were qualities of understanding that returned repeatedly after certain kinds of sleep, that were consistent and recognizable and seemed to her to be genuine information rather than mere mood. She said that the most important thing she had learned from 30 years of sleep journals was that some problems could not be solved by thought. That thought was a tool with a specific range of application, and outside that range, it was not just inadequate but counterproductive. That certain things had to be approached by a different faculty than thought, and that sleep was how you access that faculty. That sleep was not the absence of work but a different kind of work, the kind that the thinking mind could not do because the thinking mind was the obstacle. He asked her what she did with the understanding she brought back. She said, "Mostly I live it. I cannot usually say what I have understood in words. It is more that I have become slightly different, that my relationship with something has shifted, and I notice the shift in how I move through the day, in what seems important and what does not, in what I am able to do that I was not able to do the day before." She said, "It is not dramatic, it accumulates. 30 years of sleep has made me considerably different from the person I was when I started the journal, and most of that difference I could not explain or justify to you. I could only show you the journal and say, something happened here, and here, and here, and over time it added up to this, which is me as I am now, which is different from who I was." Ulf stayed a week at the lake. He slept very well there, better than he usually slept, and woke each morning with a quality of mind that he tried and largely failed to record in his book, settling eventually for noting the failure itself and the thing the failure pointed toward. On the last day, he sat at the lake's edge and looked at the water and thought about 30 years of small accumulated shifts, about the person the beekeeper had become through 30 years of attention to bees, about the person the shepherd had become through 20 years on the high pasture, about the person he himself was becoming through 10 years of walking, and about whether any of them could be said to have arrived anywhere or whether arrival was simply not the point. Chapter 10. The Astronomer's Tower. 2 days northeast of the marsh, following a ridge that ran parallel to a wide, slow river, Ulf saw the tower from a considerable distance. It was not tall by the standards of the structures he had known in the north, perhaps 4 stories, built of the same dark stone as the old road, but its position was everything, standing on the highest point of the ridge with nothing obstructing its view in any direction, the land falling away around it on all sides, so that from its upper room, which he reached by a narrow internal stair on the evening of his arrival, the horizon was visible as a complete circle, 360 degrees of unobstructed distance, the world laid out around a single point of elevation, as if arranged for exactly this purpose. The person who lived in the tower was an astronomer. She was perhaps 65, with the particular combination of precision and patience that distinguished people who had spent their lives attending to things that moved slowly and required exact observation over very long periods of time. Her name was Thora, and she had been in this tower for 30 years, having come here as a young woman specifically because of the position, having searched for years for a place with this quality of horizon before finding this ridge and this point and building the tower, which she had done herself over the course of 2 years. 1 cartload of stone at a time. She received him without surprise and with the practical hospitality of someone who knew that visitors were rare and therefore worth accommodating properly. She fed him and gave him a place to sleep in the lower room of the tower and told him he was welcome to stay as long as he was useful, by which she meant as long as he was capable of sitting quietly while she worked and of asking questions only at the intervals she would indicate, which were specific and deliberate and not frequent. He stayed 2 weeks. In that time, he watched her work every clear night, which was most nights, autumn having arrived with the particular quality it had in high exposed places, sharp and clear and very cold. She worked with instruments he did not recognize, noting positions and angles and times with a precision that was itself impressive to watch. the movements of her hands and the notations she made in her records achieved with the economy of total familiarity. Decades of the same actions performed so many times that they had become automatic, leaving her conscious attention free for the observations themselves. On the fourth clear night, when he had been sitting with her for several hours in companionable silence, she said without looking up from her instrument, "What is it you are trying to understand?" He said he was not sure he was trying to understand anything in particular, that he was more trying to attend to things and write them down. She said, "Everyone who sits up here long enough starts trying to understand something particular. The sky has a way of producing specific questions." He said he supposed his question, if he had one, was about what endured, about what lasted, about whether the things that people made and said and thought and felt left any trace that survived them. She was quiet for a while, making her notations. Then she said, "Look up." He looked up at the sky, which was very clear and very full. More stars than he usually let himself see, because looking fully at them produced in him a particular kind of vertigo that was not unpleasant, but required a certain preparedness. She said, "Everything you can see up there happened a long time ago. The light left those stars years before you were born, in some cases centuries, in some cases longer than that. What you are looking at is a record. Not a complete record, not in the way you might wish, but a genuine one. Light is information. It carries the fact of its source across enormous distances and enormous time, and arrives and is seen, and the seeing is a form of endurance, a form of the source persisting into a time and place far beyond itself." She made another notation. She said, "I have been recording the sky for 30 years, and what I have learned is that the universe is extravagant in its record-keeping. Almost nothing is truly lost, it is only changed in form and moved to places that are difficult to read." He lay awake that night in the lower room of the tower, thinking about light as information, and about the patience required to read records that arrived from very far away in forms that were difficult to interpret, and about whether his own books were, in some very small way, the same kind of thing, information sent forward into a time he would not be present for, arriving changed and in a form that might or might not be readable, but that was genuine, that had been sent with care. On the last clear night before he left, she showed him something she had not shown anyone else, a set of records going back not 30 years but 300, kept by the people who had used this ridge before her, in the same script as the old road and the mountain stone, records of the same sky observed from the same point over 3 centuries of nights, the stars mapped and remapped and the changes between the mappings noted with the same precision she brought to her own records. She had found them in a cavity in the ridge's bedrock when she was building the tower's foundation, sealed in a clay vessel that had kept them dry for as long as they had been there. She could not read the text, but she could read the maps, because the sky was the same sky, and the stars were the same stars, and the precision of the old observers matched her own, and she could see in their records the same things she saw in hers, the same patient attention brought to the same objects across 300 years of nights. He copied several of the old maps into his book alongside her current ones, the same stars in the same positions mapped 3 centuries apart, and sat for a long time with the 2 sets of maps side by side, thinking about the thread of attention that connected the unknown observers of 300 years ago to this woman in her tower. The same sky, the same care, the same desire to know and record, persisting across a gap of centuries as surely as the light of the stars persisted across distances he could not truly imagine. Chapter 11. The Blind Man Who Remembered Everything. South of the Astronomer's Ridge, in a village that had grown up around a crossroads where 2 ancient paths met in the middle of a broad plain, there lived a man who had been blind since birth, and who was, everyone in the village agreed, the person who knew the most about the world. This was a paradox that the village found entirely unremarkable, having lived with it for as long as anyone could remember, the way people who grow up near extraordinary things find them ordinary. His name was Brand, and he was perhaps 70, A small, precise man who moved through the village with the complete confidence of someone for whom every stone and slope and turning had been thoroughly mapped by other means than sight. He sat each morning outside his house in the same chair, and people came to him with questions, not because he had any formal status as a wise man or any role that the village had assigned him, but because over 70 years of acute attention to everything that was not visual, he had accumulated a quality of knowledge that was simply useful, that people found themselves wanting access to when they needed to understand something that they could not see their way to understanding. Ulf spent a week with him. He arrived, as everyone arrived, with questions, though his were different in kind from the practical questions of the villagers. He wanted to know how a person who had never seen the world understood it, what kind of world a person built from sound and touch and smell, and the information that other people carried in their voices when they spoke. Brand received this question with the mild amusement of someone who had been asked variants of it many times and found it, despite the repetition, still genuinely interesting to consider. He said, "The world I know is not a lesser world, it is a different world. In some respects, it is a more accurate world, because I have not been distracted by appearances, which are often misleading, and have been required to attend to qualities that sighted people overlook, because they have the easier option of looking." He talked for 3 evenings. He talked about sound and what it carried. The way a person's footstep told you their weight and their mood, and the condition of their joints and their urgency or lack of it. The way a voice changed with tiredness or excitement or deception or grief. The particular quality that voices had in different kinds of weather, drier and more resonant in cold, clear air, softer and more absorbed in damp. He talked about touch and the information in surfaces, the grain of different woods and stones, the temperature differential between sun-facing and shadow-facing sides of objects, the way a wind changed quality at different heights and carried different information depending on what it had passed over before reaching him. He talked about smell, which he described as the most honest of the senses because it was the hardest to control and the most direct, bypassing the interpretive layers that the other senses went through and arriving as immediate information about the chemical reality of what was there. And he talked about memory, which was the largest part of his answer to Ulf's question. He said that a person who could not see was, of necessity, a person who could not rely on the world to show itself to them again if they missed it the first time. A sighted person could look again. He could not. And so he had developed from childhood a memory that retained everything it received, not through any extraordinary gift, but through necessity. Through the understanding from the very beginning of his life that what came to him came once and had to be held because it could not be retrieved. He said, "I have 70 years of the world inside me, in a form that is, I think, more complete than most people carry, because I have never been able to afford to let anything go." Ulf asked him what he did with it, all of that retained world. Brand said, "I live in it." He was quiet for a moment and then said, "When I want to understand something that is happening now, I go and find the thing that is most like it in what I have kept, and I look at the two together, and the comparison tells me something that neither alone would tell me." He said, "I am, you might say, a very large library with no catalogue. I cannot always find what I am looking for, but I know it is there, and sometimes I find things I was not looking for that turn out to be exactly what I needed, which is the best thing that happens in any library." Ulf wrote about Brand for most of the following day, sitting in the plain outside the village, and found himself thinking about his own books in a different way than he usually thought about them, as an external version of what Brand carried internally, as a catalogue of retained world, imperfect in its own ways but genuine, reaching for the same thing by a different method. He thought about what it meant that both methods existed, that the world generated in people both the desire to retain it and the various imperfect means of doing so, and that the imperfection of the means did not diminish the desire, but perhaps was the condition of it, that the world was too large to be fully kept, and the effort to keep it anyway was what made a certain kind of life possible and worth living. Chapter 12. The Village That Moved. 3 days west of the crossroads, following one of the ancient paths back toward the south, Ulf found himself in a country where the villages moved. Not frequently, not dramatically, not in any way that suggested instability or distress, but every generation, every 30 or 40 years, the community would decide that the village had been in its current location long enough and would move it collectively to a new site. The houses would be carefully disassembled, the materials carried to the new location, the houses rebuilt, and the previous site would be left to return to whatever it had been before the village was placed upon it. He heard about this first from a farmer on the path who mentioned it as a matter of course, assuming Ulf would already know about it since it was apparently a custom observed in several villages in this part of the eastern country, and Ulf had to explain that he had not known and was very interested. And the farmer seemed surprised that this was a thing worth being interested in, which itself told him something about the difference between customs that are local and ordinary and customs that are extraordinary when seen from outside. The village he came to that evening was midway through its life in its current location. The houses were perhaps 15 years old, well maintained, the gardens established, the paths between the houses worn to the right depth, by the right amount of daily use. It had the settled quality of a place that had been somewhere long enough to have found its character, and not long enough to have begun the drift toward permanence that eventually required the move. He asked the family who housed him that night about the moving, and they explained it with the patient clarity of people who had thought about a thing so much that they could explain it simply. The moving, they said, was not about the land being used up or the location becoming undesirable. The land of the previous location was, after the village left, rested and recovered and eventually returned to the wild, which was part of the point. The moving was about not becoming fixed, about maintaining a relationship with the land that was genuinely mutual rather than extractive, that acknowledged the land's own nature and needs rather than subordinating them entirely to the needs of the community. A village that stayed in one place forever, they said, eventually stopped being able to see the place it was in because the familiarity became too total, because the village and the land became so merged in the minds of the people living there that neither could be seen clearly anymore. The move restored the ability to see on both sides of the relationship. He talked that evening with the oldest woman in the village, who had been through 2 moves in her lifetime and had been told about the move before her birth by her grandmother. She said that the most interesting part of a move was not the logistical challenge of it, which was considerable, or the grief of leaving, which was also real, but the 3 or 4 years after the village had settled in its new place, when everything was still new enough to be noticed. She said for those years people see their lives again. They see what they do every day because they are doing it in a new place, and the newness makes it visible. She said, the ordinary things that become invisible through familiarity. The way the light falls in the morning, the sound of the wind around the houses, the quality of the water from the new well. All of it is noticed, all of it is appreciated, and for those years the village is more alive than it is at any other time, because it is more attentive. She said we move in order to see again. He lay in his bedroll that night and thought about 9 years of walking as a form of this same thing. A refusal of the fixity that made things invisible, a choosing of movement so that the world continued to be seen. He thought about the astronomer who had stayed in one place for 30 years and seen more than most people who moved constantly, and about the shepherd on the high pasture who had spent 20 years on the same hillside and found it inexhaustible, and about the old couple at the edge of the marsh who had spent 60 years at the same threshold and never run out of world. He thought about the contradiction between these examples and the principle of the moving village, and decided eventually that the contradiction was not a problem to be resolved, but a tension to be held, that both things were true, and the truth was in the holding of both, that the question of when to stay and when to move was the central question of a certain kind of life, and that the answer was different for different people and different lives, and perhaps for the same person at different times, and that the only error was to stop asking the question, to choose one answer and be done with it, to let the asking go. He fell asleep with the question still open, which was where the best questions lived. Chapter 13. The Old Couple at the Edge of the Marsh. 3 days south of the lake valley, where the land dropped toward a large expanse of marsh that stretched to the southern horizon, Ulf found a house that stood at the precise boundary between dry ground and wet, built on a slight rise that was just high enough to keep it above the seasonal flooding that the people inside had evidently been accommodating for a very long time. The walls were higher than they needed to be for a house of that size, raised because water had risen that high at some point and would presumably rise that high again, and the doorstep was a single large flat stone elevated a foot above the surrounding ground, worn smooth in the center by decades of feet stepping over it. The couple who lived there were old, genuinely old, past the age where age is an approximation and into the territory where it becomes a landscape with its own features. They had been married for 60 years, which they mentioned without pride, simply as a fact, the way you mention the age of a house or a tree. Their names were, in his attempted rendering of them, Einar and Brita, and they moved through their shared domestic space with the economy of motion, of people who have done everything they do together so many times that they no longer need to coordinate or communicate about it, each knowing where the other will be and what the other will need before either of them has consciously decided anything. They had lived at the edge of this marsh for their entire married life. Einar had grown up a day's walk to the north, and Britta had grown up in the marsh itself, her family, one of the small number who lived within it rather than at its edges, navigating it by boat and by the precise knowledge of its paths and moods and the seasonal rhythms of its flooding and draining. She had come to the edge of the marsh when she married and had stayed at the edge rather than fully leaving it, and Einar had come to the edge too, to her, and they had built the house with its high walls and its elevated doorstep, and had lived their life at the margin, neither fully in the marsh nor fully out of it. He asked them, on the second evening, what it was like to live at an edge. They considered this together in the easy parallel way they considered most things, neither taking the lead and neither deferring, both thinking and both contributing to whatever emerged from the thinking. Britta said that edges were the most interesting places, that the most interesting things happened at the boundary between two different kinds of world. Einar said that edges were also the most demanding places, that you had to know two things instead of one, had to be competent in two different environments and their different logics. Britta said that the demand was also the interest. Einar said that after 60 years he was still learning both, still finding things in both the marsh and the dry land that he had not understood before, which he found at his age more satisfying than he could easily express. Britta said that the marsh was a teacher that did not run out of things to teach. Einar said neither does she. They talked about the marsh over 2 evenings, and what they described was a world of extraordinary complexity and beauty and difficulty, a world that changed with the seasons and the years and the weather and the long slow cycles of geological time in ways that made it perpetually different from what it had been before, that resisted the kind of complete knowledge that would make it familiar in the deadening sense, that always had something new to show. They knew this marsh better than they knew anything else in the world, and they did not know it fully, had not come close to knowing it fully, in 60 years of daily contact, and the gap between what they knew and what there was to know seemed to them not a failure but a gift, the guarantee that the world was larger than any individual understanding of it and would remain so, that there would always be more. He left on the third morning with the marsh on his left and the dry ground on his right, and walked east along the edge, which seemed the appropriate direction after what he had heard, and wrote about the old couple for most of the day, stopping frequently to add things he had forgotten to include and to correct things he had written imprecisely, and arrived at the end of the day with a piece of writing he thought was among the best he had done, which meant it was inadequate to its subject in ways he could identify rather than in ways he could not. Chapter 14. The Mountain That Spoke Once. Deep in the eastern country, perhaps 6 weeks beyond the lake valley, a mountain rose that was different from the mountains Ulf had seen before. Not in its shape, which was ordinary enough, a broad base rising through forest to bare rock, and then to a peak that was not dramatic in height, but that had a presence out of proportion to its size. The way certain people have a presence that exceeds their physical dimensions. What was different was what people said about it. He heard it first from a family whose farm was in the mountain's shadow, who mentioned it the way you mention something important but familiar, without building up to it. The man said simply and directly that mountain spoke once. Ulf asked when. The man said a long time ago, before my grandfather's grandfather. Ulf asked what it said. The man was quiet for a moment and then said, "We do not know exactly. The people who were there wrote it down, but the writing is in a script that no one can read now." He said this without visible frustration, as if the unintelligibility of the record was simply another fact about the event, no more remarkable than the event itself. He found the stone on which the writing had been recorded on the second day of his time in the mountain shadow. It was not hidden, was in fact positioned at the most obvious point on the path that led toward the mountain's base, a flat-topped boulder of the same dark grey stone as the old road, its upper surface covered in the same script he had found on the paving stone of the old road, which meant the old road and this mountain were connected by at least this much, that the same people who had built the road had been here when the mountain spoke, had recorded what it said, and had placed the record where anyone approaching would find it. He sat with the stone for most of a day, copying the script into his book as he had copied the road inscription, and thinking about the connection between the road and the mountain and the ruins on the hill, all built or recorded in the same script, all in this eastern country, all part of some coherent world that had existed here and was now gone in all particulars except the marks it had left, the road and the stones and the tree carved into the wall of the ruined hall. He thought about what kind of world it had been, what kind of people had built a straight road through this landscape, had come to this mountain when it spoke and recorded what it said, had built the great hall on the ridge. He could not know. He had the marks, and the marks exceeded his ability to read them, and the gap was permanent. And this too, as with so much he had encountered, was a fact that was simply true and could be either mourned or accepted, and the acceptance was more useful. He climbed toward the mountain on the third day, not to the summit, which was beyond his equipment and his ambition, but to the base of the bare rock where the tree line ended and the mountain became something other than what it had been below. He sat there for a long time, looking out over the country he had walked through, which from this height was visible as a pattern, the river valleys and the ridges and the flatlands and the distant suggestion of the marsh to the south, all of it arranged in a way that made its own kind of sense when seen from above, a sense that was not available from within it. He thought about the mountain speaking. He thought about what it would mean for a mountain to speak, what speaking would mean for something that large and that old, what it would take for something that did not ordinarily speak to speak, what pressure or occasion would produce the one utterance in all the centuries. And he thought about the fact that the people who heard it had written it down, had placed the record where others would find it, had wanted the speaking to be known, had understood that it mattered. He thought about the writing on the stone, and about his own book, and about all the records that were made and kept, and whether any of them endured, whether any speech, uttered once in all the centuries, survived in a form that said what it had originally meant. He came back down in the afternoon and walked east the following morning, carrying the copied inscription and the question it had given him, which was the kind of question that would take years to approach an answer to if it had an answer, which he thought it probably did, somewhere, in some form he had not yet encountered. Chapter 15. The Place Where the Root Drinks. He found it on a morning in late summer, at the end of a journey that had taken him from the first farmstead east of the mountains through all the places that had been described to him with varying degrees of directness over the months of his walking, the weavers and the beekeeper and the old road and the ruins and the two-voiced river and the shepherd on the high pasture and the luminescent forest and the valley of the long sleep and the edge of the marsh and the mountain that spoke once, and now this. It was not what he had expected, which was to say it was not what he had constructed from the references people had made to it. The careful reverence, the translated phrase, the place where the tree's root drinks. He had imagined something dramatic, something visible from a distance, something that announced itself. What he found was a low place between two hills, unremarkable in its topography, where a spring came out of the ground with a quietness that was, when he noticed it, itself remarkable. The water emerged not from a crack in rock or a bubbling pool, but from the earth itself, from a wide area of perhaps 20 paces across in which the ground was simply wet, the water appearing at the surface as if cooled rather than driven, with no pressure behind it, no drama, just the water being there, soaking slowly into the surrounding ground and feeding a small stream that ran east into a stand of old trees. The trees were ash, old ash, very old. Their trunks the diameter of the great tree the old woman had sat beside in the forest at home, their root systems so extensive that the ground for 20 paces around each tree was shaped by them, raised and lowered in the patterns of what lay beneath, the whole grove a map of its own hidden structure. The roots of the largest tree extended to the edge of the spring, and some of them beneath it, and the tree stood there drinking with the patience of something that has been drinking from the same source for so long that the drinking and the source have become one continuous fact. He sat at the edge of the spring for a long time without writing and without particularly thinking, which was unusual for him, but which felt right, felt like what the place asked. The water came out of the ground with its quiet persistence. The ash trees stood with their roots in the wet earth. The light was the particular light of late summer, full and warm and already carrying in it the first suggestion of the end of itself, the slight gold that preceded autumn. Birds moved in the ash trees above him with small sounds. He took out the piece of cloth the weaver had given him and held it in his hands and looked at the pattern, which he still could not read but which seemed, here, in this light, to be about something he recognized, something he had been approaching for months without knowing exactly what he was approaching. He took out the small clay vessel of honey from the beekeeper and held it without opening it, feeling the weight of it, the sealed wax under his thumb. He took out the carved bone from the vulva's hair and the knife from the smith, and he laid these things out in the wet grass beside the spring and looked at them and thought about the people who had given them to him, and the things they had known and said and made. He sat there until the light began to change, and then he wrote. He wrote for a long time, longer than he usually wrote in a single sitting, filling the last pages of his 4th book and beginning the 5th, and what he wrote was not a description of the place exactly, though it contained a description, and not a story exactly, though it contained stories, but something more like an attempt to say what, 9 years and then some of walking had accumulated into, what the sum of all the places and all the people and all the stories came to when you tried to hold them together. He did not succeed entirely, but he came closer than he had come before to saying the thing he had been circling for years, the thing about attention and about what attention built over time, about the difference between a life that noticed and a life that did not, about what it meant to write things down, to carry them, to refuse to let them be lost. The water came out of the ground quietly and soaked into the earth and fed the stream that ran east into the trees. The ash trees stood with their roots drinking. The light moved through the afternoon, and he wrote, and the birds moved in the branches, and somewhere far above all of it, in the great structure that held the 9 worlds in its roots and branches, something very large breathed in and then breathed out, as it had always done, as it would always do, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to the small figure sitting by the spring with his book open and his pen moving, and entirely, in its vast inhuman way, present. He closed the book when the light was finally gone and sat in the dark for a while with the spring still coming out of the ground beside him, which it would do in the morning when he left and in all the mornings after that, long after he had walked on east and then turned south and then eventually, following the road that had no map, found his way back to the place where his walking had begun, or found some other beginning or simply continued, which was, when he thought about it sitting in the dark beside the root spring with the ash trees above him, and the night coming down, the thing that walking always came to. Not arrival. Continuation. The road going on, and the walker going on with it, and the world going on around both of them. Full of things that exceeded understanding and were worth paying attention to anyway, were worth writing down, were worth carrying forward into whatever came next.